Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. There we go. I think I can hear myself. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Mike McMullen. I'm president of the Carroll County Chamber. I think I know most everybody in the room. And this is going to be filmed by our friends from Community Media Center. So CMC's here. They're filming this. And if you could turn your cell phones on quiet. And I want to take this moment now. Sorry, I took one of your announcements. I took two of them. You can just say them again. But I want to introduce to you, for her first time as the chair of the board for 2018, give a rousing round of applause to Ms. Suzette Covalt.
Thank you all so much, and I am not a public speaker, so please bear with me. My name is Suzette Covalt. What was that?
I said you are now.
My name is Suzette Covalt. I'm the Commercial Banking Officer for Farmers and Merchants Bank, and it is my honor to serve as the chair of the Carroll County Chamber for 2018. I want to thank you all for coming today, and I hope that you have enjoyed your lunch or are continuing to enjoy your lunch. Thank you, Best Western. You did a wonderful job preparing. Today is our annual Carroll County Budget Luncheon, and you will be hearing shortly from Mr. Ted Zaleski, the Director of Management and Budget for Carroll County. Ted has graciously been providing informative insight into the county budget to chamber members for years, and we look forward to what he has to say today. I think Mike's already said this is being filmed from the being filmed by the Community Media Center, and they will be posting it to their website. I will not be watching it. No, I'm just kidding. Allow me to introduce our two sponsors who will be speaking during this program. Please stand and be recognized. Sherry Cracium-Bolin, tax preparer, or tax partner for RLH, CPAs, and business advisors. A Carroll County Chamber member for 65 years. Not Sherry, by the way. And Dave Peliquin, President, Main Street Advisors. And a Carroll County Chamber member for 20 years. We would like to recognize at this time elected or appointed officials that are with us today. Commissioner Richard Rothschild, Commissioner Dennis Frazier, Westminster Mayor Joe Dominic, Westminster City Councilman Ben Yingling, and former County Commissioner Dave Roush. Did I miss anyone? Yes, okay. From the Board of Education, board member Marcia Herbert. And also with us today is the Superintendent of Carroll County Public Schools, Steve Guthrie. And we'd also like to recognize Dr. James Ball, President of Carroll Community College. Will the former past chairs of the Chamber of Commerce Board please stand and be recognized? Dave Bollinger of Barnes Bollinger Insurance. Wayne Barnes of R. Wayne Barnes Life and Long-Term Care. Mike Fox of Lehigh Cement. Ben Yingling of Crawford Yingling Insurance. Steve Wance of Carroll Community College. And immediate past chair Lynn Wheeler from the Carroll County Public Libraries. Did I miss anyone? Yes, doing good. If you are a member of the current board of the Carroll County Chamber, please stand and be recognized. Today's sponsors are RLH CPAs and Business Advisors and Main Street Advisors, LLC. Our first sponsor's message will be delivered by Sherry Cracium-Bolin with RLH CPAs and Business Advisors.
As Suzette kind of mentioned, we've been around the Westminster area and Carroll County for a very long time. I actually started here about 75 years ago in the Westminster community, and most recently you knew us as regularly Manhawk, and now RLH CPAs and Business Advisors. We have 3 offices, one in Hanover, Pennsylvania, one in Frederick, Maryland, and then of course right here on East Main Street in Westminster. RLH is still independently owned and operated after all these years as a regional public accounting firm. We provide a wide variety of services. There's a little flyer on all your tables that has a whole list of those, but I won't go into them. Some of my team members are here today that help out providing all these services. I want to recognize 2 of my partners that are here today, Carl Lehman and Wanda Lynn, as well as 3 of our accountants from our Westminster office, Valerie Price, Collins Lethbridge, and Patrick Markovich. So, thanks, guys.
Yeah, we'll give them a round of applause.
Yes, they do all the hard work. As the firm's tax partner, I would be remiss not to mention during my talk today about the little tax cut bill. I'm guessing maybe you guys have heard about that a little bit. I could talk all day, but I know Mike only wants me to talk for a couple minutes, so I won't go there. But I will mention that, as you might realize, this is a major, major tax law change, and there's so many changes in it that the IRS is still working through technical corrections, and we expect to get a lot more guidance. But most likely, this will impact each and every one of us in some way or another. Of course, we've been getting all the questions, and as soon as I walked in here, is that you, Ben? Yeah. Right away. Entertainment, no more entertainment deduction. So there are a lot of things that we still need some guidance on. But to that end, because we do know there's so many complexities, there's things that have gotten more complicated. While yes, there will be a few things that they've simplified, overall it's a very complicated bill, and they've added some additional things that I think will actually cause a lot of complexity for many business owners, especially those owning pass-through entities such as partnerships and S-corps. So something that's on the horizon, and of course we get asked all the time, is there something we need to do now? While most of it doesn't impact us till next tax season, it's really impacting us right now because it really took effect January 1. So in an effort to try and help our clients in the community in that, we did start out something called Tax Act Tuesday. So the blog on our website. So every Tuesday we'll be tackling just one more area of complexity, the new tax law. So we suggest that sign up for our newsletter or visit our website and check that out. There's some information about it on the flyer that we left on your table. So that's all I have. Check it out. All right.
Thank you, Sherry, for your comments in support of the Chamber. Our next sponsor's message will be given by Dave Peliquin, President of Main Street Advisors, LLC.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ted's become very, very popular as a speaker. Having known him a long time, it's hard to come before him and realize I'm going to get upstage no matter what I say. But I always like to come up, Main Street Advisors is a fee-only registered investment advisory firm. Been in Westminster since 1999. We take fiduciary status with your money and your investments. I'm kind of like a scold. Every year I've been up here, I bring up something that I'd like everyone to take back with them. And this one is mortgage. Your mortgage is to pull out the amortization table, take a look at what your current trajectory is for paying it off. Most of us are not going to get tax deductions anymore for the interest. It's always I just sat with someone yesterday who's 62, ready to retire, has a small mortgage, and even he didn't finish his sentence when he said, but I still get to And the answer is no. You don't get any break on the interest anymore. I think the numbers are that about 30% of people itemized before this law, and it's going to be 5% afterwards, something like that. So it means tens of millions of people aren't going to have to file Schedule A. It's going to mean a lot of us, too, because the higher tax states, of which Maryland's one, have got a cap of $10,000 that you can deduct for your state income taxes and your property tax, and I think that's right. But the point is, most of us in here are paying more than $10,000 in state income tax and property tax, and depending how much more, some of us could be paying more after all is said and done. So that's one thing to take away. The last thing I'll say is, I know everyone's has now heard there's been this huge 7% drop in the stock market, and just keep in mind, it's about back where it was around the holidays. So, take it with a grain of salt. If you already had a thought-out, decent strategy and plan, not much has changed. The worry would be that some of you have heard of the VIX, and it's kind of a newfangled measurement. It's a volatility index. All you need to know is it averages around 20 over the last 30 years. It's been 10 for the last 2 years until last week, and it spiked to 50. So what I would tell you is there's like this huge overreaction to interest rates going up because a lot of investors were thinking it would stay calm. Last year, there were 8 moves up or down 1% in the stock market. The average is 50. So we've been having just a nice steady ride for a couple of years. At the first sign of some trouble, meaning interest rates going up, money manager tools, these are now algorithms and machine trades have kicked in, and that's all you're seeing, I think. So talk to your advisor if you haven't already, but if you've got a good long-term plan already, I don't know that this is the beginning of anything bad. There, now that'll lead Christine to be able to introduce Ted. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dave, and for your support of the Chamber. If anyone is interested in sponsoring any events, please see Mike McMullen before you leave here today. There are a few sponsorships available for 2018. Now let's begin our program. I'm sure most of you know Ted Zaleski as Carroll County's Director of Management and Budget. Ted is responsible for the budget, grants, and risk management functions, and he is also a major resource to the Chamber and to the rest of the community. Ted lives in Carroll County, just outside of Westminster. Today, he will talk about the issues involving the county's fiscal year budget 2018 and beyond, and then we'll take your questions afterwards. Help me welcome Ted.
You know, 2 years ago, I spoke from up there.
Last year.
Last year I was over here, and I remember saying I wasn't sure how I felt about that because if things got ugly, I was a lot closer to the door. I figured this is about perfect. I'm not as fast as I used to be, but I probably can beat most of you to the door. Yeah, I was thinking as we were eating, I always like coming to this, and I think part of it's almost like a reunion. You get together with all these people. Some I've known for a lot of years now, known for all kind of different reasons. Some people for multiple reasons. Like Lorraine Fulton here, I first met as assistant superintendent in the public school system. Then I knew her in her role at Gerstel, and now she is heading up the fundraising effort for the Carroll County Public Library. And Kelly Frager, I first met her a long time ago when we were discussing what eventually became Pars Ridge Elementary School. And then I think she remained involved in some other issues down in Mount Airy for a while. But now she's working for Blue Water Advisory, who's done some work with the county, and kind of reconnected with her. And I have stories that could go all around the room, but don't have time for that. I do want to mention one other thing. Steve Guthrie and Sandy Ox have both announced their retirements from the school system and from the Carroll Arts Center. I don't know if this is true, but I heard a rumor that they've already reserved seats for next year. Even though they're gone, they want to be here. And then one other thought before we get going. Commissioner Wance sent me an email about an hour or so ago apologizing because he wasn't going to be here. He had already scheduled this visit to he said, a winery distillery. I'm not sure where he is. But I said, okay, winery distillery, Ted. Winery distillery, Ted. So I think you made the right call. All right, so there's a lot to talk about and not nearly enough time to talk about it all. So let's get going. I want to head south on 97, head for Washington, D.C., home of our federal government. You heard our sponsors talk a little bit about some things that are happening. There's a lot of interesting things going on. But really looming in importance for our budget are these recent tax bill changes and also some things going on with the federal budget, or maybe more appropriately, the lack of a federal budget. So on the tax bill, as you heard, the really big changes are in the increase in the standard deduction and the cap on salt. And no, before some wise guy says, what, you left the top off the salt shaker? No, we're talking about state and local taxes, which have been deductible for you, but that is all changing now. So this is all federal. You say, okay, so why are you worried about that? And actually, I didn't say I was worried, but I assumed that you all assumed that I was worried. It matters to us locally because the state tax form is tied to your federal tax form, and our Carroll County tax form is tied to the state tax form. So those changes up at the federal level are going to flow on through to the tax forms that we're going to fill out here. And for the regulars, you probably remember income tax is our second largest revenue, so this matters to us. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the details, although for a small fee, I think Sherry would be willing to talk to you about it. Federal changes make it likely that fewer taxpayers are going to itemize. Maryland's standard deduction is much smaller than the federal standard deduction, and you can't use the state standard deduction if you don't use the federal. So, like I said, this all starts finding its way to us. Everything else being equal, and I'm not arguing everything else is going to be equal, but everything else being equal, the changes seem likely to lead to state and county taxpayers paying more in local income tax. Now, putting aside what you think of the tax bill, I'm not trying to argue this was a good thing or a bad thing. Saying part of the problem with us trying to understand what this is going to mean now is that this bill was hurriedly passed. There was little analysis. There was little debate. We're trying to figure out everything now. And it's going to take, I really believe, years before we truly understand what the impact of these changes was on the county's budget. When I talk about these things, I also want to remind you, and I've said this before, everything I'm talking about is from the view of county revenue. I'm not trying to take positions on these things. I'm just saying changes happen somewhere else. There are implications for us, and we need to be thinking about those things. Now, the federal budget is also a concern, and my big interest is places where the federal budget might get cut and costs get passed on to the state government. Now, one thing that was kind of getting highlighted was Child Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. Now, that one actually did get picked up in the federal budget again, so for now, that one's not a problem. But Medicare remains a really big question. This could be a question of hundreds of millions of dollars potentially in the state budget. Now, I'm going to be coming to the state budget in just a minute. We're going to head east on Route 50 to Annapolis. There's talk in Annapolis about legislation to prevent the unintended ripple effect that I'm talking about. You know, and the basic line of logic is, okay, they made changes at the federal government. At the state level, we weren't out to make any changes. These are things just happening. We ought to do something about that. So there's talk of legislation that would somehow offset these changes. And on the surface, it sounds perfectly reasonable. You know, that change had nothing to do with us. We didn't intend to do this. We don't want that ripple effect to happen. My concern here is, how do you go about trying to fix this problem? One thing that gets in the way is nobody can, with confidence, quantify the impact. So you're going to be trying to fix a problem that you don't know how big the problem is. Now, the Comptroller's Office, Maryland Comptroller's Office, actually did a significant amount of work. They used tax year 14 tax returns, which is the most recent year that is fully completed, and try to simulate what this bill would do. And they did come up with information, but they had to make lots of assumptions. And one big assumption is about taxpayer behavior. How many people are going to choose to act this way or act that way? And they made assumptions, and maybe you can argue they're reasonable, but they don't know what Mike McMullen is going to do when he sits down to file his taxes. And there are different ways people could approach this, and some people might just be looking at their federal taxes and say, I want to maximize my federal benefit. Other people might look at federal, state, and local and say, I need to think about all three of these and get the biggest net benefit. And until it happens, we're not going to know who chose to do what. And there are a lot of variables to deal with, too many for anybody to say, okay, we've got it figured out. Here's what this is going to mean to you. Now, I mentioned taxpayer behavior. I want to mention something else that's been happening that muddies the waters for us. And you might remember, I've told you before, that income tax is notoriously difficult to project, very volatile. It can change quickly with little warning or explanation. But we have two things that are going to make it even worse for us for a few years. Between the election and the end of 2016, there's a lot of thought that there was a taxpayer behavior change, and people were choosing to move income from tax year 16 into tax year 17, hoping for more favorable tax situation. And then this year, following the tax bill, you have the same thing, except now people are moving money from 17 into 18. So even if we thought we could figure out what's really going on, this is going to make things so difficult to see what's going on. Again, it's going to take us years. And really, what's going to happen is a few years down the road, we will have statistics from the state. We're going to be able to look backwards and say, oh, that's what happened. Now we can see it. But while it's happening, we're not going to know. So they're talking about legislation to offset this change. And I say, I'm worried. How do you legislate offsetting something that you don't know the size of? And here's where my concern really hits, and that's what if they get it wrong? What if they go too far? They more than offset the change and put the state budget in a worse position than it is today. And I will argue the state can't afford to put their budget in a worse position, and we can't afford for them to put our budget in a worse position. But that seems like a possibility to me. I'm not predicting it's going to happen, but I don't see how you can say, no, that won't happen. But let's say they do pass legislation and they get it exactly right. Another problem is the focus is on this one thing, the change in the deduction. There are other things in the tax bill that might make things go other directions. And there are things happening in the federal budget that might make things go in other directions. So even if they get this right, by ignoring those other pieces, we might still end up in that same position where they end up in a worse position than they are today. So the state budget. The governor has proposed a balanced budget. Now, this is no big news. It's required by law. You can't really take any special credit for saying, I introduced a balanced budget. But that budget is balanced with an assumption that legislation is going to get passed. There's a lot of little pieces in his budget that only work if the General Assembly passes the laws that will be necessary to make them work. If those don't happen, then it's not a balanced budget. Now, I'm not going to go through all the pieces of it, but I want to mention two things in the mix. One, and the governor tried to do this last year, this is his second time to do it, he's looking for what he calls relief from mandated expenditures. In Maryland, the governor has an unusual amount of power in the budget. A consequence of this over the years is the General Assembly sometimes not being able to do it through the budget will make things happen by passing legislation that says, Governor, you must fund this thing this way. That's what he's after. He wants to back off of that sum. And what he's proposed is the lesser of existing legislation. So there's already a law that says you have to increase something 2% or whatever, or the revenue estimate of the state minus 1%. That raises some interesting things to think about. And the first one that occurs to me is I feel sorry for the revenue estimators, because this introduces a level of pressure that wasn't there before. You know, you have somebody who's actively rooting for you to come in with a lower number than you might think is what's really going to happen. And then the other thing is these mandated expenditures. And we talk about mandated expenditures just as a concept. You know, it's easy to say, that's bad. We shouldn't have mandated expenditures. But we need to think about what those mandated expenditures are, and many of them affect people in this room. We're talking about things like the public school system, the community college, the library, the health department, and funding that comes to counties and our 8 towns. So if we're going to say those mandated expenditures are going to be lower, this is not just some theoretical change. This is a change to dollars that are coming to these agencies. And again, we have implications to deal with. What will those changes mean? How do we deal with them? The other one I want to mention is a cost that will be passed on from the state to the county. We're already there. This is the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. And in case it isn't perfectly clear from that name, we're talking about a state department with state employees reporting to state supervisors doing state work. The county has absolutely nothing to do with their operations, but we are currently paying half of the cost of those operations. And the reason we are doing that is because in a difficult year for the state to balance their budget, this was a way to free up some money. You might get different explanations, but I'm here to say that's why we are paying this money. The governor has proposed legislation that would move that 50% up to 90% and would add the cost of the SDAT director's office, which previously wasn't part of the calculation. This is about a $600,000 a year change for us. And nobody's any better off. This doesn't change how anything works. The only change is the state used to spend this money. Now we'll have to spend this money. Then another interesting possible consequence of this is, looking at how the assessment process works in Maryland. Now, arguably, I think Maryland probably has it right. You have the people setting the tax rates over here, and you have the people doing the assessments over here. In many parts of the country, you have the same hands in both sides of that. I think there are good arguments for the arrangement we have. But if the counties are going to be paying nearly all the cost of this operation, it gets hard to just sit back and say, well, you guys just go ahead and do whatever you want, send us the bill, no problem. Now, that's also subject to legislation. If the General Assembly doesn't pass it, we'll still be left with that 50%, but we won't move up to 90%. And then, if the governor doesn't get the pieces of legislation he's looking for, his proposed budget is not a balanced budget. If there are federal changes that haven't been accounted for, and I'm not suggesting that he could have, there's too much uncertainty, but if something happens that's not in here, again, the budget isn't balanced. Then the budget has been advertised as 100% structurally balanced, and I've really struggled to figure out what that means. The fiscal year 19 proposed budget is balanced, like I said, as it has to be by law. It's not optional. So I'm not sure what it means to call it 100% structurally balanced. Now, usually when you talk about structural balance or imbalance, you're looking multiple years into the future. And if you look at the state's budget in fiscal year 24, based on their current revenue projections and their current expenditure projections, meaning the choices they've made on the expenditure side, fiscal year 24 would have about $1.2 billion less revenue than they expect to have in expenditures. That's not structurally balanced. That's far from structurally balanced. And that's why I said a little bit earlier, the state can't afford to put themselves in a worse position. They can't be taking on well, I don't mean they can't, but if they take on additional expenditures or they haven't planned for expenditures, that 1.2 becomes 1.4 or 1.6 or whatever the number takes you to. It will be a problem. There's no room to simply absorb something at the state level. So let's head back up. That other 97, 695 and 795, we're back here in Carroll County. And what is the impact of all this in Carroll County? And I'll spare you my usual, probably too long talk about what the state calls aid to local government and how misleading it is. But just to remind you that aid to local government is schools, college, library, health department, county and towns. 85% of that is money that goes to the schools. And with the exception of county and towns, none of those are actually county agencies. Those are all state agencies that exist in state law and receive state funding, but we play a part in funding them as well. So that pot of agencies, the governor's budget is a total increase to all of them of a little less than $1 million. And little as that is, it's probably not even as much as it sounds like, because I think much of it is probably going to be one-time money or short-term money. This is not money that people are going to be able to plan on for multiple years. And two little side notes. Carroll County's increase in the governor's budget is the 23rd smallest of the 24 jurisdictions in Carroll County. And on a per capita basis, we are 18th in state funding. Now, I've told you before that for the county, there's not a whole lot of revenue for them to take away. Most of it is already gone. But when we're talking about the school system and the college and the health department, funding from the state is a big deal. It matters. So go a little bit deeper. Carroll County Public Schools are looking at an increase of about $300,000. About $100,000 of that is still subject to legislation. Not tremendous news, but a lot better than what we've been getting for the last handful of years, which have been annual decreases in state funding. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The community college is going to get something approaching $400,000, or about 4%. Small increase for the library, health department flat. For county and towns, highway user revenue and program open space look to be up about $500,000 or so. This is the place where I'm saying this is potentially one-time or short-term funding. Money has been draining away from these state-shared taxes. What's going to locals has been getting diverted to the state for some years now. Looks a little bit better this year, but my long-term hopes are not great. And then we had that passed on cost from SDAT, $600,000 a year. This is actually what I would argue is the largest ongoing impact, a negative $600,000 a year. So this is the 60th Board of Commissioners' final budget. Take a look back at what they did with their first 3 years a little bit. The first 3 years grew a total of $31.5 million, or about 8.5%. So 2.5 or 2.7% a year, something like that. So we've had some growth, but modest. What did they do with that modest growth? 19.2 million of that 31.5 went to Carroll County Public Schools, about 11.5% increase over the 3 years. The community college had an almost 24% increase over 3 years. Sheriff, 18%. State's Attorney's Office, 32%. If we look at the total of all education and public safety funding, $28.2 million increase over 3 years. And remember, the total budget increase was 31.5. Now, it's overly simple to just compare those two numbers because there's a lot of other things going on, ups and downs. But you can look and say, of the money that the commissioners had available to them, it was largely focused on education and public safety. Now, you can still argue Did enough money go to this purpose or this agency? I'm not trying to take debate off the table, just saying of what was there to give out to somebody, it largely went to those two functions. Some of the things they've focused on in their 3 years, the opioid problem has gotten a lot of attention, and they've made significant funding changes to the sheriff, the state's attorney, and youth service bureau for enforcement, education, and treatment, trying to do something to make this a better situation. This actually started under the 59th board, but this board has continued to expand services for veterans. Two big efforts here. One is transportation to regional veterans health facilities. There are services available, but what we found is many veterans in Carroll County weren't taking those services because they couldn't get to them. We now have the means for people to regularly get to facilities in 3 different states, Roberta? 4 different states.
3 states.
Okay, three different states. The other piece of it is there are now 3 people, part-time positions, who devote their time to connecting veterans with the services that are available to them. It's not us providing service, it's helping us get them to the services. And again, what we found was veterans were not taking advantage of existing services because they didn't know how to do it. It was too complicated. They couldn't get there for one reason or another. Now, the state actually provides some help doing this, but they have somebody who comes to Carroll County half a day, once a month or something like that. It's just clearly not enough help. So the commissioners created these positions focused solely on how do I help you take advantage of the benefits that are available to you. And it's been heavily used. We have a benefit for our volunteer fire rescue EMS providers called LOSAP, Length of Service Awards Program. And basically, if you put in enough years with high levels of activity, you eventually qualify for a monthly benefit, a thank you of sorts for the volunteer service. The commissioners, I think it was in the budget that we're in right now, increased those benefits. Again, trying to say, thank you to people who have done, a pretty incredible job for Carroll County for a long time. And the Public Safety Training Center, we used to have a little setup out at Route 32 in Kate Wagner. We now have a bigger, nicer one, which is actually still being developed. Some of the pieces are there, but we're still doing more. This is largely for the use of those same people I was just talking about with LOSAP, but the sheriff and other agencies also make use of this for training. So I'm not going to talk as much about county revenue as I have sometimes in the past, but I want to hit on a couple things. Property tax, our largest revenue. There is good news here. Last assessment was Westminster, Tawnytown in the Northwest. And this is another one of those things, good news from a county revenue point of view. As individuals, you might differ with the idea that it's good news. But we had built into our projections 5.5% growth for that portion of the county. We actually got 7.1%. This is the first time in a long time that we've seen the actual assessment come in that much more than what we had counted on coming in. So 7.1%, 6.3 of that was from the residential side, 9.7 from the commercial side. Looking ahead to next year, Group 1 is the entire south portion of the county, and it's our largest piece of the assessable base. Our current projections have them in at 9%. We're feeling pretty comfortable now that 10% might be a reasonable place to be, and we might even talk beyond that, but I haven't gotten comfortable thinking more. But at the very least, we're comfortable with where we are, and we might be able to build a little bit more room into our picture. And then new construction, remember our revenues, property tax revenues go up for 2 reasons. One is there's existing buildings, they get reassessed. The other is you build a new building and it's added to your assessable base. Well, we plan every year to have $120 million of new construction. About 3/4 of that is residential and 1/4 of it is commercial. The last 2.5 years, we've seen stronger growth than $120 million a year. Now, it hasn't been enough for long enough for me yet to argue we ought to build that into our projections, but it's certainly becoming part of the conversation now. So good news on the property tax side. Oh, okay. Don't want to leave you feeling too good. All that said about property tax, when we look out 6 years from now in our largest revenue, we still don't reach 3% growth in fiscal year '24. We're getting close, but still don't even get to 3%. Income tax is a bit of a worry right now. We are about on the same pace we were last year, but we're projecting to be about $3.5 million short of what we budgeted at the end of the year. And we have a long way to go. We've only seen about a quarter of the receipts that come in. We'll get our next big distribution near the end of this month. And one of the really hard things about income tax is that's the last big distribution we'll see until after the commissioners have adopted the budget. So we're going to be very interested to see what we get in this February distribution. But it's always scary, whether it's good news or bad news. It's hard to be too confident of what it's saying because you still have half of the money left to come in later. So we are thinking about what this means this year. We're thinking about what it means for our expectations for next year. Over the course of the 6-year plan, we've assumed 5% growth in income tax. Nothing has really changed my thinking on that. That still seems reasonable to me. The problem is that because income tax is so volatile, 5% on average is almost never 5% in any one year. It's going to be less or more. And if less is now, that means we have something to be trying to figure out. So we'll be looking to February, hoping for reasonably good news, if not really good news, but we'll have to react when we get that. And a few other things in my mind. Schools, I talked about, they got a small increase in funding, which was a change from recent years where we've been seeing decreases. We actually added 34 students this year. It's the first time we've had an increase in enrollment. I don't know how many years.
2005.
Since 2005.
Wow.
Now, 34 students, 1 year, is not enough for me to say, okay, new trend. But it's at least took us off of the old trend. And it'll be, again, really interesting to see what happens next year. One really interesting thing for me, some of you might say, do you really think that's interesting? But births in Carroll County are rising again. We had gone through years of declining births, which is part of the explanation for declining enrollment. They're going up again. And the reason that's interesting to me is because, for the most part, a birth turns into a kindergarten student who turns into a first grader, and so on and so on. So that's another piece of good news. Now, the school system is going to be tackling questions of redistricting and closing schools. Now, we already went through a process to close schools that led to closing 3 schools. It was a lot of fun. Everybody's looking to have that conversation again. But I think we might be looking at a different situation. Well, I know we're looking at a different situation now than we were back then, and maybe different enough that it becomes a very different sort of conversation. Back then, and I talked about this at least 1 year at one of these, I said we had a school system that was built for 31,000 students. We had 29,000 students. That seemed reasonable. Then things changed, and we had projections that might have taken us to 21 or 22,000 students. 31,000 seats, 22,000 students, that's hard to say that makes sense. And I said to you, I don't remember exactly my words, but I said something along the lines of, there was no question in my mind that the Board of Education had to make a decision to close schools. Now, that doesn't change anything for people who want to argue, well, yeah, I agree with that, just not this school. But they had to do something. The situation now is looking a little different. We're down 25,000 students or so, and maybe that line stop dropping. Again, I'm not jumping there yet, but maybe. And you look at the current capacity in the school system. Elementary schools, we're at 85%. So 85% of the seats have a kid sitting in them. And over 10 years, that's projected to go to 97%. Now, I'm not saying that 97% is right yet, but based on the information we have now, that's the current projection. Middle schools are at 91 and projected to stay at 91. And high schools are at 85 and projected to drop to 79. But remember those births. The kids are going to turn into kindergartners. The elementary school, as a system, is projected to be near capacity. They're going to become middle school students. They're going to become high school students. So at some point, if all that holds true, the high school numbers will start to move toward greater use of our capacity as well. You have to figure that's going to color the conversations about closing schools and where we go from there. Redistricting, a different idea. And I'm not aware that Carroll County has ever done a comprehensive redistricting. We've made some little changes. We've redistricted when we opened schools. But we've not looked at the whole county and said, how do we balance this all out? How do we make sense of this? And this is important because when I'm talking about those capacity numbers, I'm talking about across the system. The problem is, in a practical way, a seat at Tawnytown Elementary School can't be exchanged with a seat at Carrolltown Elementary School. The only way to make that capacity useful, and our greatest capacity is in the Northwest. Our most crowded area is the Southeast. The only way to make that work is through a series of moves all across the county that move towards something that is more balanced across the county. The problem is parents hate redistricting. And you'll run into the same thing. Oh, we understand you need to redistrict. Just don't move my kid. Don't move my neighborhood. And it's a hard thing to do. And I say former boards of education have not gotten this done. I understand why. It's hard. People get angry. People get mean. And it can be easy to say, okay, we don't really need to do this. Let's just leave things as they are. But I'm arguing this needs to be done. The county needs to look at the entire county and make sense of this. Last year, I talked about Next Gen 911, the next generation of how 911 calls are handled. And I was worried. And I said, this is going to cost money. I don't know how much. I don't know what this is going to mean to us. There's still a lot we don't know, but we know more now than we did a year ago, and I'm a lot more comfortable now than I was a year ago. I think most of what we will need to do has either already been done or is already slated to be done. Some of this with help from a state fund. When you pay your phone bill, there's a tax on there. That money goes to funding things like this. So I'm still anxious to figure out exactly what this is all going to mean, but nowhere near as concerned as I was this time last year. And then one last thing, future of fire, rescue, and EMS. I talked about this a little bit earlier. We have a mostly volunteer system. How to say this? Our EMS is almost entirely people who are paid, but they are paid in a volunteer system, and they are not paid like career people in other jurisdictions. And it's a problem. Fire, rescue, we're a volunteer system. Legislation is being introduced in Annapolis this year to give the commissioners the authority to provide fire, rescue, and EMS services in Carroll County. And it's very important for people to understand this is not something that the commissioners asked for. This is something that the volunteer system asked for. And they're asking for it because they're saying, we're struggling. We need to know that the path to getting to something else is going to be available to us. This is an effort of the volunteers. This has been a long conversation, and this is literally true. When I started as the low man on the totem pole budget analyst 2 or 3 years ago, one of my first budget assignments was fire EMS. And one of the first things I was involved in was a group that was put together to talk about the future of EMS. There have been, I can't even guess how many groups to look at these questions over the years. And we've never moved on to, okay, let's talk about implementation. How does this happen? This is the first time that something has emerged from one of these efforts. And right now, what's emerged is this request for legislation, but there's a very important recognition that something is going to have to happen. Now, I can't go any further describing what's going to happen because those talks have barely even begun. There will be lots of things to work out. How is this going to work? How is this going to look like? What's the funding? Where's the money coming from? Where's the money going? Who's going to do what? But it's an important conversation that's getting started, and I think that is really good news. So that is what I have for you today. We can take some questions. I hear there are a couple microphones in the room somewhere, so if you have a question, if you could just wait for a microphone to get to you so our television audience can hear you.
Ted, you mentioned about 911.
Does not take instruction very well.
That's my reputation. Ted, you mentioned 911 being funded by a tax on bills. As landlines decrease, what is the supplemental source of revenue that will continue to support those programs?
To the extent that that tax doesn't cover the costs, then it just becomes a general fund tax burden. And there's actually another interesting conversation going on. Maryland, I believe, is the only state that implements that tax on the phone bill rather than on the phone number. And I'm sure many of you have phone setups where you have 2, 4, maybe 6 phones on your bill. In other states, each one of those would be generating this revenue. In Maryland, it doesn't matter how many phones, it's as if there was one phone there. And to follow a little further on that, the revenue that's generated does not come anywhere near actually covering all the costs.
Following instructions. Good afternoon, everybody. Ted, I just wanted to follow up on something that you said. I have some fairly recent information from Annapolis regarding the various things that are in motion regarding the tax plan. And since this is the Chamber of Commerce and you all may have a chance to lobby some of these issues, I want to tell you what the different lines of thought are that are in play right now in Annapolis. First off, you should know that on Wednesday morning of last week, we were told there would be a $700 million increase in state revenue. The same evening, I ran into some high-level officials in the Comptroller's office that told me, no, it's only going to be $300 million. And one official said to me, I think we're going to recommend that we do nothing in just this year and just wait and see what the amount really is so we don't overshoot. So that's one train of thought that's out there, which I don't particularly like. With respect to making the adjustments, the train of thought that we heard last week, for those of you that itemize, is to pass legislation that would allow you to write off any state, local, and property taxes that were clipped off at the federal level, let you add that back into your state itemized deductions. So that's one option. And the second option that's been floated in Annapolis is to just decouple completely and allow Maryland taxpayers to itemize even if they have not itemized on their federal return. Because right now, in order to itemize at the state level, you must have itemized at the federal level. So that's in play. You can certainly lobby your elected officials for whatever you like. Now, just one caution, the politics of this are perverse. There's no other word for it. They're perverse. Because there's certainly one camp of people in Annapolis that would like to see revenues increase. So they have all the advantages of raising revenue and none of the disadvantages of being blamed for it. They can point to Washington, D.C. And on the other side of the coin, you've got people that want to be a hero and smack down and fix the tax plan that was created by an empire they view as evil out of Washington, D.C. So nobody knows what's going to happen. I will tell you that at the Maryland Association of Counties, we will be looking at all the bills in the next week or two and trying to decide which way we're going to go as county officials in terms of our recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, and on those possible solutions, another little piece of this is if the state decouples from the federal government or adds its own itemization or any other things that aren't in the mix now, somebody has to administer those changes. And if we have our own itemization, right now we depend on the IRS to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to. The state would need to do something or just say honor system. There's a lot of things that would have to work out, and this is another one of those hidden sort of costs. We actually pay the state an administrative fee for collecting our income tax. If their costs go up, our costs are going to go up. So there would be another cost to us that's really not going to show up anywhere. It's not something that gets a budget line or a debate in a committee. It just happens. Right? One more question. Okay.
Good afternoon, Ted. You mentioned that Carroll County was 23rd out of 24 counties receiving funding from the state, or revenues from the state.
The increase in this year's budget.
Yeah, and I'm curious kind of what the arithmetic is that it was a surprising number to me that we were that far down on a list considering our size.
Well, you heard the agencies. It's just, you look at the numbers. The school system got $300,000, the college got $350,000, a few thousand for the library, nothing for the health department. That's just where it adds up. Other counties got bigger increases in some of those places. Mike says one more question. Now, I would be willing to take more questions, but it's Mike's show. Yes. We don't have another question. Oh, did you say something?
Oh, no.
Okay, well, thanks as always for coming out.
Great job, Ted. Next year, same time, same place? Is that a yes? Oh, yeah. 16 years this guy's been coming to do that. That shows dedication. I want to thank our sponsors again. Now, one thing I heard, RLH, CPAs, and business advisors, I'm finally getting that down. 65 years a member, but in business for 75? What happened to those first 10 years? All right, you weren't there. But I want to thank you guys. I want to thank Dave from Main Street Advisors. So a round of applause. I think Dave might be gone, but thank them. And the staff at Best Western, nice job here, guys. Thank you so much. Give them a round of applause. And our friends at Community Media Center, CMC, you guys are great. You guys are great. Thank you for being here. Miss Suzette Covalt, first meeting, very nicely done. Give her a round of applause. Peggy Soper, who's back in the saddle at the Chamber and did a lot of work with this event, as she does with all. Give her some recognition. We are accepting applications for Leadership Carroll, class of 2019. Every year, I say this, every year people say, yeah, I think I'll apply for that. And every year about 5 or 6 of you wait until the class is completely full and overflowing to send in your applications. So don't be that person this year. Fill out the application. It's online, no deposits due right now, but we will fill up. We always do. You can find it at our website, carrollcountychamber.org. Upcoming events, there's a little sheet everybody's place out there. I don't know that I've got time to go over every one of them, but we've got some really cool stuff coming up. One I'd like to mention, March 8th, we had a PM Connection scheduled. It was canceled. It's back on again at a different location. So some of you may have seen a mailer that we sent out that said it was canceled, but we are now having it in Mount Airy at Enter, Exit, Escape, a Carroll Biz Challenge winner from a couple years ago. It's one of those escape rooms. It's awesome. We took our leadership class, or at least some of them there, I think it was this year. And if you've never been, it's something worth doing. So that'll be on March 8th from 4 to 6. The other events are all listed here. They're also all on our website, as are all of our members. So as I like to always say, try to keep your money local wherever you can. if it's retail, if it's restaurant, if it's accountants, if it's whatever, keep the money local. It goes around. I mean, it helps to go to taxes so we can have more good things that Ted can come and talk to us about. So last but not least, I think we're going to Austria this year. The Chamber likes to do lots of fun. We have lots of fun. We have trips. Commissioner Rothschild, I'm counting on you for this year because the first 5 trips we did were to Communist Cuba, Communist Cuba, Communist Cuba, Communist China, Communist China. And he said, well, if you ever do a trip that's not to a communist country, he'll go with us. So he's a man of his word. He's a man of his word. So it's just go right to our website, sign up. We'll have a lot of fun, okay? Other than that, I don't think I missed anything. Thank you all for coming, and our meeting's adjourned.